Most people think they know gospel music, choir robes, Sunday mornings, familiar melodies that fade into the background. But every once in a while, someone comes along who completely rewrites what gospel can sound like, feel like, and mean. And when news broke that Richard Smallwood had passed away, it didn't just ripple through churches, it sent shockwaves through the entire music world. Because this wasn't just the loss of a singer, it was the quiet exit of a man whose music carried people through their darkest moments, even when he himself was barely holding on. What makes this story hit harder is that for decades, Richard Smallwood's voice was associated with strength, faith, and unshakable belief. But behind those soaring harmonies and powerful arrangements was a man fighting battles most listeners never knew about. And the way those battles shaped his music is the reason his songs still stop people in their tracks today. He didn't grow up chasing fame, he grew up chasing sound. Born in Atlanta and raised in Washington, D.C., music entered his life before most kids even knew what rhythm was. By the time he was old enough to reach the piano keys comfortably, he was already playing by ear, not practicing scales, not copying sheet music, just listening, absorbing, and translating emotion into sound. People around him noticed early that this wasn't normal talent. This was something deeper, something instinctive. Church played a massive role, but not in the way people might expect. For Smallwood, church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a laboratory, a space where emotion, struggle, hope, and belief all collided at once. That environment taught him something crucial early on. Music didn't need to be simple to be powerful, it needed to be honest. And that belief followed him straight into adulthood. When he enrolled at Howard University, he didn't just study music, he immersed himself in it. Classical training sharpened his technical skill, but it also gave him tools that most gospel artists at the time didn't have. He studied composers who built tension, who layered emotion, who knew how to let silence speak just as loudly as sound. And instead of abandoning gospel for classical prestige, Smallwood did something risky. He fused them. At the time, that fusion wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Gospel, in many spaces, was expected to stay within certain boundaries. Keep it familiar, keep it accessible, don't make it too complex. But Smallwood didn't believe faith was simple, so why should the music be? That mindset led him to form his own group, and once the music finally reached a wider audience, something unexpected happened. Instead of rejecting the complexity, people leaned in. Choirs struggled to sing his arrangements at first, some still do, but once they got it, they felt it. His music didn't just fill a room, it wrapped around people. And then came the songs that would change everything. There's a reason certain compositions seem to follow people through their lives. You hear them at funerals, weddings, moments of grief, moments of triumph. One of Smallwood's most famous works was written during a deeply personal low point. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't riding a wave of success. He was hurting, struggling emotionally in ways that felt isolating and heavy. Instead of hiding that pain, he poured it into music. That song didn't scream optimism, it didn't rush to joy, it sat in surrender, and that's why it hit so hard. People who were exhausted, people who were grieving, people who felt like faith was slipping through their fingers suddenly had words for what they were feeling, not polished words, honest ones. And that honesty traveled far beyond church walls. Suddenly, artists from completely different genres were paying attention. Major pop and R&B singers were covering his songs, not because they fit radio formulas, but because they carried emotional weight you couldn't fake. When one of his compositions appeared in a major Hollywood film soundtrack, it introduced his work to millions who had never stepped foot inside a gospel choir rehearsal. What's wild is that even as his influence grew, Smallwood himself never leaned into celebrity culture. He wasn't chasing headlines, he wasn't manufacturing drama. He stayed focused on composition, on craft, on meaning. That quiet consistency is part of why his music aged so well. It wasn't tied to trends, it was tied to human emotion. But while audiences saw confidence and control, there was another side of the story that stayed mostly out of view. Smallwood spoke openly later in life about struggling with deep emotional lows. At times, the weight of expectation, creativity, and faith felt overwhelming. And instead of weakening his work, those struggles sharpened it. He understood despair not as a concept, but as a lived experience. That understanding gave his music an authenticity that listeners could sense, even if they couldn't explain it. That's also why choirs often describe performing his songs as emotionally exhausting and deeply rewarding at the same time. His compositions demand presence. You can't rush through them. You can't phone them in. They force singers to sit with the meaning, not just hit the notes. As the years passed, his legacy only expanded. He performed internationally. His music echoed through massive venues and intimate sanctuaries alike. He was honored by institutions that understood the technical brilliance behind his work, not just the spiritual impact. And yet, through it all, he remained grounded in the idea that music was a form of service. Then came the quieter chapters. Health challenges began to slow him down. Performances became less frequent. Public appearances became rarer. For fans, it sometimes felt like he had simply stepped back into the background. But his music never left. Choirs kept singing it, soloists kept returning to it, and listeners kept finding it exactly when they needed it most. When news of his passing finally emerged, the reaction wasn't loud in the traditional sense. There were no scandal-driven headlines, no controversy-fueled debates. Instead, there was something more telling. Stories, testimonies, people sharing how his music carried them through loss, uncertainty, fear, and change. That kind of response doesn't come from hype. It comes from connection. Richard Smallwood didn't just write songs, he built emotional shelters, places where people could sit with their faith without pretending everything was okay, places where doubt wasn't treated as failure but as part of the journey. That perspective is rare, and it's why his work continues to feel relevant even decades after it was first written. What makes his legacy even more powerful is that he never positioned himself as the center of it. The music was always the focus. The message was always bigger than the messenger. And in an industry often driven by ego and visibility, that restraint speaks volumes. Long after the final note fades, his influence remains woven into the fabric of gospel music and beyond. You hear it in modern arrangements. You feel it in performances that dare to slow down and let emotion breathe. And you recognize it every time a song doesn't rush to resolution, but instead invites reflection. In the end, Richard Smallwood's story isn't just about music. It's about honesty, about creating something true even when it costs you comfort, and about trusting that vulnerability, when shaped with care, can become a lifeline for others. His voice may be gone, but the echoes are everywhere. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that live between the headlines and the music, make sure you subscribe to Inside Hollywood, because some legacies don't end when the spotlight fades. They only get louder.